She came to withdraw her own money. They called security instead. At Rivergate Trust's flagship branch manager Heather McBride saw a modestly dressed black woman, Marilyn Jacobs, and assumed the worst. Tellers whispered, eyes rolled. The humiliation was public and cruel. But when they picked Marilyn, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was the CEO of the entire bank. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that would shake the company from top to bottom. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. Sunlight streamed through the bank's tall windows, illuminating the quiet tension in the lobby. Behind marble counters and glass walls, a silent war of respect and prejudice unfolded, until one woman decided enough was enough. Marilyn Jacobs had been to many banks in her life, but never had she been made to feel so small. She stood at the teller's window of Rivergate Trust's downtown branch, dressed in simple navy slacks, a soft gray sweater, and a leather purse worn from use but cared for like a treasure. Her voice was steady, her request simple. "I'd like to withdraw from my account, please." She slid her ID and bank card forward with care. The teller glanced down, then up again. Her smile faded. "One moment," she muttered, and stepped away. Within minutes, 2 more staff had gathered. Marilyn heard the words before she saw who said them. "She doesn't look like she should be asking for that kind of money." A ripple of laughter followed. The lobby, all glass and marble, suddenly felt icy. Marilyn didn't flinch. Not when her transaction slip was slid back toward her. Not when the branch manager, a tall woman named Heather McBride, appeared with a tight smile and an even tighter voice. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't process this request. Not for someone in your situation." Marilyn's hand trembled slightly, but she steadied it against the counter. "And what situation would that be?" Heather didn't answer, but everyone in the room knew. Have you ever stood in a place where you were a rightful guest, but made to feel like an intruder? The security guard shifted uncomfortably. Other customers avoided eye contact. A young man in line frowned, then looked away. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was loud. But Marilyn said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she slowly picked up her card, her ID, and her pride. She placed them back in her purse like a woman who had done this before, like someone who had learned to wear her dignity like armor. In that moment, the staff thought they had dismissed a nobody. They were wrong. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one writing the final chapter. Marilyn Jacobs hadn't always carried herself with such stillness. Once, years ago, she stood on the other side of that very counter, wearing the bank's uniform, her name stitched neatly on a plastic badge that read, "Teller Trainee." She remembered those early mornings, how the doors creaked open before sunrise, how she used to count bills in the back room, nerves trembling like the coins in her apron pocket. There were no silver spoons, no connections, just ambition wrapped in quiet humility. What she lacked in privilege, she made up for in sheer perseverance. She stayed late to learn what others skimmed. She asked questions that made her supervisors uncomfortable. She studied finance textbooks by lamplight after tucking her daughter into bed. And slowly, step by determined step, Marilyn climbed. From teller to account specialist, then loan officer, then branch assistant. Along the way, she earned her MBA at night, seated beside classmates half her age. When the bank merged, she was chosen to lead one of its toughest regions, not because of luck, but because she turned numbers around where others failed. She was passed over more than once. Not the right fit, they'd say, and she always knew what that meant. But she smiled anyway. She shook hands, wrote thank you emails, and returned to work harder. And then, one morning on 26 years after her first deposit slip, she was named Chief Executive Officer of Rivergate Trust. But you wouldn't know that from the way Heather McBride looked at her today. or from the chuckle she heard behind her as she stood at that counter. Isn't it strange how quickly people forget that every face they see might carry a story deeper than they imagine? Marilyn had spent her life proving herself. Now she was done proving. She was ready to teach. Marilyn sat quietly in the corner of the Rivergate Trust branch lobby. She'd chosen that particular seat on purpose, half in the shadow of a tall ficus, half in view of the main service area. To the staff, she was just another middle-aged woman with a modest purse and scuffed shoes. No fanfare, no power suit, no clue. That morning, she'd watched. For nearly 40 minutes, she saw a white man in a tailored suit walk in. He hadn't reached the line before a teller greeted him with a warm smile and waved him straight through. A young woman in yoga pants and earbuds was helped quickly in with laughter. But when a Latino gentleman in janitor scrubs stepped forward, the tone shifted. Stern questions, double checks. Then an older black woman was told, "You'll have to wait," while the queue around her moved without pause. By the time Marilyn rose and approached the counter, she had already seen enough to understand exactly how this branch operated, and exactly who it did not prioritize. She handed over her ID and bank card. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." The teller, Beth, her name tag said, froze for a half second. "How much?" "115,000, Marilyn replied calmly. Beth blinked. "That's a large amount," she said, almost a whisper. In the span of 3 minutes, Marilyn went from customer to problem. A senior teller appeared behind Beth, then another employee, and then, from across the room, the familiar click of heels. Heather McBride was coming. Their questions came not in the name of security, but suspicion. Where did the money come from? Can you prove the funds are yours? Are you expecting a settlement? Every word, every glance carried the same message. You don't belong here. Have you ever been treated like a thief when all you've done is ask for what is already yours? Marilyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She simply looked up toward the ceiling camera, quietly reminding herself and them that the truth was recording every second. And sometimes, the eyes watching from above see more than we expect. Heather McBride stood just inches away from Marilyn, her arms crossed, her chin slightly raised, a posture of command. "This withdrawal doesn't seem appropriate for someone in your situation," she said, her voice wrapped in silk but sharpened like glass. The words echoed. Around them, the room fell into hush. Even the soft clicking of keyboards paused, as if the entire branch was holding its breath. Marilyn felt the sting, not of the words alone, but of their certainty. They weren't asking questions anymore. They were delivering judgment. One teller fidgeted with unfiled slips, eyes glued to the counter. Another smirked behind his hand, whispering to a colleague. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether he should step forward or fade away. Still, Marilyn stood tall. "I'd like to speak with someone who has the authority to complete my transaction," she said evenly. "Preferably someone who understands what customer service is meant to be." Heather leaned in, her voice dipping into condescension. "Ma'am, I am the highest authority in this branch, and maybe you'd be more comfortable taking this to a check-cashing place down the street." A pause, sharp, bitter. Marilyn didn't move. Instead, she reached into her purse and retrieved her phone. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed one name. "Dion?" "Yes, it's Marilyn. I'm at the downtown branch. I need you here, now." Heather flinched, not at the words, but at the name. Diane Pierce, head of operations. One of the few people in the company whose word could outrank hers. The smirk slipped from the teller's face. The confidence drained from the room. What happens in a place where someone's presence was mocked one moment, only to be feared the next? It was the moment the mask cracked, the beginning of the unraveling. And Marilyn, calm as ever, slid her phone back into her purse like she had all the time in the world. Because power, when it's real, doesn't shout. It waits. Upstairs, on the 19th floor of Rivergate Trust's headquarters, a different kind of tension filled the air. Diane Pierce had just ended the call with Marilyn Jacobs. Her blood ran cold the moment she heard the voice, not because it was angry, but because it wasn't. It was calm. It was deliberate. And Diane knew what that meant. Without a word, she stood up, heels clicking against the polished floor. "Get me every complaint from the downtown branch, filed and unfiled," she barked to her assistant. "And patch the live security feed to the conference room." Within minutes, the screens in the executive boardroom flickered to life. What they saw chilled the room. There stood Marilyn Rivergate, Trust's CEO, being scrutinized, dismissed, and humiliated by her own staff. They watched as Heather McBride condescended, as the tellers whispered, as customers looked on, some amused, others embarrassed. And all of it was being captured on the bank's own high-definition security cameras. In that moment, the reality hit. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was culture unchecked, unchallenged, and quietly thriving beneath the surface. Board members exchanged looks that needed no words. A name was whispered. "That's the CEO." And then silence. Have you ever witnessed something so clearly wrong that you couldn't unsee it, no matter how badly you wanted to? Diane's hands tightened around her tablet. She watched Marilyn, composed, firm, untouched by panic. And in her heart, a fire rose. This wasn't just about one woman being disrespected. It was about every customer who'd walked out feeling invisible. She turned to the board. "We act now." The decision was instant. Because sometimes, the only thing more powerful than witnessing injustice is realizing it has a witness with the authority to end it. The heavy glass doors of the Rivergate Trust branch flew open with a crack that echoed through the lobby. Every head turned. Diane Pierce entered like a storm, contained in heels and a tailored navy suit. Her eyes swept the room with surgical precision and locked on Marilyn. "Stop this," she said, voice ringing with command. "Right now." Heather McBride froze, her confidence drained as fast as the color in her face. "Ms. Pierce, I didn't know she was—" "Do you have any idea who this is?" Diane pointed toward Marilyn, her voice sharp as ice. The room fell into stunned silence. Tellers stood rigid. A smirking employee dropped his pen. Even the security guard stepped back, suddenly aware he'd been asked to escort a CEO off her own property. "This," Diane said firmly, "is Marilyn Jacobs, the CEO of Rivergate Trust." Heather stumbled backward, eyes wide. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The truth didn't need volume. It had landed with weight. And just like that, everything changed. Marilyn hadn't moved. She remained where she'd stood the entire time. Steady, calm, undeniable. How quickly can a room shift from mockery to shame? Diane didn't wait for explanations. She pulled up the live footage on her tablet. Customer after customer, treated differently based on color, attire, or accent. "We've seen it all," she said. "Every word, every look." Then came the moment no one in that branch would forget. "Effective immediately," Marilyn said, her voice low but firm. "Heather McBride, Richard Fields, Mark Talbot, you are all terminated." There was no shouting, no vengeance, just consequence, as clear and certain as the click of Diane's pen. Have you ever seen justice arrive, not with fury, but with clarity? As the disgraced staff were quietly led away, the air felt different. Heavier, yet cleaner. Marilyn didn't smile. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to restore something that had long been lost. 3 days later, Marilyn Jacobs stood at a podium beneath the Rivergate Trust logo. The press conference was broadcast live. Cameras clicked, lights glared, but Marilyn's gaze was steady. "Today," she began, "we are launching the Equitable Banking Initiative, an investment of $50 million in rebuilding trust from the ground up." Behind her stood Diane Pierce, and the board no longer silent, no longer uncertain. Their presence said what their words could not. We're listening now. Marilyn outlined the changes. Real ones. New training rooted in civil rights principles. Bonuses tied not just to profit, but to fairness. An internal review board composed of customers who had once felt invisible in these very branches. And then came the boldest change of all. In every branch across this country, Marilyn said, you'll now see a sign. She held up a replica. All customers deserve dignity, fairness, and respect. If your experience falls short, call this number. Beneath the bold letters, one phone number, her direct office line. A hush fell. It wasn't just symbolic, it was personal accountability. What would it mean if every person empowered dared to be that reachable? In the front row sat men and women who had faced discrimination at banks. Entrepreneurs denied loans. Immigrants questioned more harshly. Elders passed over. Marilyn had invited them here not as props, but as partners. You are no longer stories hidden in silence, she said. You are the reason we change. For the first time, the reporters didn't shout questions. They sat still, writing, listening. Because some stories don't need drama to make an impact, they need truth. And Marilyn, once denied at the counter, was now setting the standard at the top. 6 months later, Marilyn Jacobs walked into another Rivergate Trust branch. No cameras, no assistants, just her in soft denim, a long cardigan, and flats worn from use. The kind of outfit that drew no attention. That was exactly the point. She sat quietly, watched the flow of customers. An older black couple entered. The teller smiled and walked them to a private desk. A young man in work boots deposited his paycheck. No delays, no extra forms. A Latina business owner asked about a loan, and the branch manager personally offered to review her application. Marilyn felt the shift, not in policy, but in spirit. She approached the teller at the window. "Good morning," the young woman said brightly. "How can I help you today?" Marilyn smiled, just checking in. The teller's eyes flicked to the name on the account screen. A moment of surprise. Then, respect. Not fear, not panic, just understanding. Outside the window, a new sign caught the morning light. All customers deserve dignity, fairness, and respect. If your experience falls short, call this number. Below it, the number still rang to Marilyn's office. And it was used. Some calls came in tears, others in frustration. Some just wanted to say thank you. But every voice was heard. Every story mattered. What would it mean if every institution truly answered when the people spoke? Marilyn didn't stay long. She never did. Her role wasn't to be the face of every branch. It was to ensure the values reached every corner. As she walked out, a customer held the door for her. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said with a nod. She returned the nod, quietly, grateful, not for recognition, but for the feeling that justice, once planted with care, had started to grow. And sometimes the smallest changes, done with resolve, are the ones that last the longest. Sometimes the world will misjudge you before you even speak. They'll look at your clothes, your skin, or the lines on your face, and assume they already know your story. But here's the truth. Your value was never theirs to measure. Marilyn Jacobs didn't raise her voice or seek revenge. She stood tall, not to prove anything, but because her dignity was rooted deep. And when the time came, the truth stood with her. In life, we may not all wear titles or sit in boardrooms, but each of us carries something just as powerful. Our lived experience, our quiet strength, our right to be treated with respect. So, if someone ever doubts your worth, let them. What matters is that you remember it, and that maybe, just maybe, you help someone else remember theirs too. Because real change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in gently and leaves the whole room still. It wasn't the headlines or the press conference that marked the true ending. It was Marilyn Jacobs, quietly walking back into a branch where every customer was seen, heard, and served with dignity. No applause, no spotlight. Just the calm strength of someone who had stood through a storm and refused to let it harden her heart. From that moment on, Rivergate Trust wasn't just rebuilding its policies. It was rebuilding its conscience. Marilyn made sure that what happened in that lobby wouldn't be buried, but studied, remembered, and used to guide every new decision. Not for revenge, but for repair. The echoes of that day still live in training rooms, branch policies, and the voices of customers who now speak up, knowing someone is finally listening. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism, so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.